will be your moderator for today. The webinar will be starting soon, and a gentle reminder to please keep your mics muted. The main chat box will also be disabled during the webinar. If you face any technical issues, please message the username tech support. And if you have any questions at any point in time during the webinar, please post them to the user-named Q&A. And thank you for your patience as we wait for our final participants to join us this evening. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Science Behind Animal Behavior webinar series, where we will be focusing on the ethology of dogs. We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Kristina Spaulding as our speaker for today. Kristina is a certified applied animal behaviorist and has been in the dog training and behavior profession for over 20 years. She has a PhD in biopsychology, where she studies the biological basis of behavior and how it can be applied to prevention and early intervention of behavior problems in dogs. Kristina teaches regularly on the science of animal behavior in courses and conferences. And she also sits on the board of the IABC Foundation and the Fear-Free Advisory Group. Hence, we are really excited to have her here today to share her expert knowledge in the field of canine ethology. I'm sure all of you in this Zoom session are very keen to ask her questions, and you may do so by typing in the chat box to the user-named Q&A at any time during the session. Gentle reminder again to please mute your microphones as well. Thank you very much. And without further ado, I shall hand the time over to Kristina. Over to you, Kristina.
Thank you. And welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm looking forward to talking to you guys today. So I'm going to be talking today just a little bit of background information about stray dogs, who they are, and what we know about their behaviors. So I'm going to talk first about domestication. Then I'm going to talk about what we know specifically about stray dogs when they're kind of living free. And then I'm going to start to discuss stress and how that impacts behavior and how that relates to stray dogs. So we will go ahead and get started. First thing we want to try and understand is, how did domestication happen? And I think this is helpful because it gives us a framework for thinking about dog behavior in general. And there's actually several different theories. Probably researchers think that there's probably many different things happened that resulted ultimately in domestication. So the first theory, which probably is the most well-known, is this idea that people, many thousands of years ago, basically went into the den and took puppies out of the den and then raised them as part of their community. And there are actually accounts of this happening in certain communities, like in Australia. So this is something that did occur to some extent, but we don't actually think this is the only way that domestication happened. The other thing that likely happened is a much more hands-off process where there was a certain population of wild canids, probably some kind of ancestor of the wolf, that started to hang around these human settlements. This would have most likely been around the time that agriculture really started and people started to settle in one place for longer periods of time. And you probably had this sort of subpopulation of wolves that were less frightened of people and were living in the vicinity and basically living off of the trash that people discarded. And in fact, this is something that we still see dogs do in many communities around the world. And so this probably happened as well. And then the third theory has to do with this idea that we actually probably co-evolved together. So I think many of us think of dog domestication as something that humans went in, we initiated, and we have kind of controlled the process. But we're starting to get some evidence now that this may have actually been a two-way street. Not to say that dogs were intentionally controlling our behavior in any way, but that basically we have been living in such close quarters for such a long time that coexistence with dogs may have actually shaped our behavior over time as well. And so if you take all three of these things together, it starts to kind of give us a picture of what this relationship might kind of look like, and what the different things that impact that relationship might be. The other thing that I think it's really important to understand about domestication is that as based on the evidence that we have, there don't seem to have really been new behaviors that have been added to the sort of the menu of behaviors from wild animals. And it seems that there's very few behaviors from wild animals that have disappeared completely. So basically what that means is if you were to make a list of dog behavior and a list of wolf behavior, sort of probably it was an ancestor of the modern wolf. But if you were to make a list of those behaviors, you'd probably have the same list essentially. What changes is these stimulus thresholds for behavior. So essentially, how easily are different behaviors triggered? So for example, if we look at this population of foxes in Russia, where they've been breeding them for many, many, many generations to have a lower flight distance, those foxes show a lot of similarities to domestic dogs and may be a good model of how, sort of an accelerated model of how domestication happens. And so one of the things that you tend to see in dogs compared to wild canids is that you can get closer to them before they flee, right? So obviously dogs and other canids are going to run away from time to time, but they're going to be less likely to do it, or you're going to be able to get closer to them before they do it. And so there's all kinds of other behaviors that you may see these changes in as well. So we would expect domestic dogs to be less fearful of certain things like people than their wild counterparts, lower levels of aggression, probably. And then there are other things like barking, where so wolves actually do bark, but it's very, very rare. Whereas, of course, dogs can bark quite a bit. So barking is one thing where they probably have lower thresholds than their wild counterparts, where it's much easier to trigger a dog to bark than it would be another wild species of canid. And so when we're thinking about domestication, keep this in mind, is it's not so much that their behavior is totally different than the animals that they were domesticated from. It's more that certain behaviors are going to occur more easily or less easily than the wild ancestor. And so what that tells us is that actually, the behavior of the domestic dog is still in many ways very similar to the ancestral species. And when we talk tomorrow, we're going to talk more about why that's important and what it tells us about living with dogs and trying to give them a good life. So the other thing I want to talk about is this concept of how do we think about the dogs that we live with? And one of the common models, there's a researcher named Adam Miklósi, and he uses this term babymorphism. And this is the idea that we kind of compare dog behaviors to toddlers, right? Human toddlers. So we say, well, dogs are, they're basically at the same level as a 3-year-old child, is something you might hear frequently. And so certainly there are similarities, right? Because with dogs, owners or guardians play often a parenting role with dogs, just like we do with children. And so there's a lot of similarities there in that relationship. But this model does ignore some important things. So for example, the dog-human relationship varies quite a bit. So in many situations, the dogs may be living in the family and they may be sort of being treated as a child, not necessarily literally, it kind of depends on the household, but there's some similarities there. And there are a lot of different kinds of dogs, right? So yes, pet dogs may fit this model in some ways, but there's going to be other situations, for example, with working dogs or free-ranging dogs. You guys refer to them, I think, as stray dogs mostly. Those are different kinds of relationships. So this model is not going to fit every relationship between humans and dogs. And so it's probably too limiting. The other problem with it is that it doesn't acknowledge this life history difference, right? So when dogs come and live with us, they generally live with us until, they pass away, and they don't grow up and leave their family at some point and go out and start a family on their own. And so, yes, there are similarities here, but it's probably not the best model. Also, there are really important sort of cognitive and behavioral differences between dogs and kids. And so Miklósi sort of argues that maybe we really need something unique when talking about dogs. He says friendship, that's maybe a little bit better, but doesn't necessarily encompass all of the different types of relationships that we have. So this is actually kind of a hard thing to nail down, is how do we describe our relationship with dogs? Another really common model is Lupomorphism, and this is also comes from Miklósi. And this is this assumption that dogs are basically wolves with only minor changes. And I did just talk about how there are a lot of similarities between dogs and wolves. So again, this model also has some strengths to it, right? The problem is that they're not completely wolves, right? So if this was true, if dogs were basically wolves, that means that these stray dogs would essentially behave as wolves. And as you'll learn later on in this talk, that's not actually true. And the same idea would be, if it's just an environmental thing, right, then that would suggest that captive wolves would become dog-like, and they don't do that either. Also, wolf behavior varies. So it's easy to kind of assume that all wolves are the same, but there's going to be individual variation, and it also varies depending on where the wolves are living, and then these behaviors are going to change over time. So dogs have probably been domesticated for somewhere between 10 and 15,000 years. And so the behavior of wolves 15,000 years ago, when they kind of diverged, is not necessarily the same as the behavior of wolves now in the modern world. So really what I think, and this sounds so obvious, right? Like dogs are dogs, they're their own thing. But I think, at least in this country, in the US, it's taken us a long time to come to this position that dogs are really their own thing. They're not like little children. I mean, there's some similarities, but there's a lot of differences too. And they're not exactly like wolves either. So we really have to view them as their own individual creature and not try and put them into the box of some other animal. I mean, I think it's easier to do that than recognizing the complexity that makes dogs dogs. But this is going to be what's ultimately best for them and for their people they're living with, right? Because if we can understand them for who they truly are, then the dogs that we live with are going to be happier, which means they're going to have less behavior issues, and they're going to be much easier and more enjoyable to live with. So that brings us to talking about stray dog behavior. And the first thing I want to say about stray dog behavior is we know very little about it. So there have been studies that have been done, but there's a lot of conflicting observations. And this may be due to regional differences. So we have some areas of the world where there's very few stray dogs, or maybe the only stray dogs are dogs that used to be living with people and have sort of escaped or been dumped. You have other areas where there's, breeding populations of stray dogs. Some of them are very urban, some of them are more rural. And so there's a lot of differences. And this may explain why so many of the studies come up with different results in terms of what behavior looks like. Having said that, there are still many similarities, and I'm going to try and talk about those. So If we think about wolves, wolves live in packs, and those packs are groups of related individuals. Usually we're talking about parents, offspring, and then maybe grandchildren. And that pack of wolves travels together, they rest together, they hunt together. They're very coordinated in that way. They tend to kind of do things as a unit. Stray dogs actually don't do this. This is not the same kind of behavior that we see from stray dogs. So commonly, these groups of stray dogs are not related individuals, or they're not entirely related. You may have some that are related, but others that aren't. And the groups primarily seem to serve as a breeding function. They don't hunt together cooperatively, typically, in the same way that wolves do. Again, you do sometimes see this, but it's not consistent. And so even though they're not related, they do tend to be, they know each other, right? Because they have mostly cohesive groups, but then other studies have shown that you kind of get this, what's called fission fusion, where sort of certain groups will break off and form other groups. And so they're not quite as consistent as wolf packs. And so Miklósi, who again, he's comes up a lot because he's done a lot of research. He has a book on these, on the ethology of dogs, but he suggests using the word band instead of pack to indicate that there are these differences between wolves and stray dogs. And so the size can vary widely. Sort of 30 seems to be the max, but you could have groups that are much smaller than that as well. And so sometimes it can be hard to define group, especially in these stray dogs, because there are so many differences, but these are dogs that tend to kind of affiliate with each other consistently. And then it's going to, the size is going to depend a lot on the food supply, right? So if you have scarce resources, you're going to see smaller groups. If you have a really large source of food, you're going to tend to see larger groups of dogs. And also geographic features. So how easy is it for dogs to disperse once they reach a certain group size? Is there a huge mountain range in the way, or an ocean or something like that? You're going to tend to see larger groups if dispersal is difficult, or if there's really large spacing between human settlements, for example. So I want to talk a little bit about social or dominance hierarchies, because this is something that has been used a lot to explain dog behavior, and there's a lot of misinformation about this. So I want to try and clear that up a little bit. So dominance hierarchies evolved to limit competition over limited resources. So basically they evolved to reduce aggression. And they really, from an ethological standpoint, are used to describe a relationship between two individuals. So you would say this dog is higher ranking than that dog, or this wolf is higher ranking than that wolf, rather than saying this individual is a dominant individual and describing it as a personality trait. It really just, it has to do with, you're looking at two animals and which one is higher ranking, which one has more access to resources. The traditional view of a hierarchy is like this. You have the alpha up here, and then you have one animal below them that is dominant over all the other animals, and then one below them that's dominant over all the other animals, and so on. This is a very strict hierarchical model. And this was based on research in captive wolves that we now know were demonstrating abnormal behavior because they were living in captivity and they were not part of a family group. They were probably under high levels of stress. So what we know now is that in wolves, at least, the social hierarchy is largely age-based. So the older individuals tend to be higher ranking. There's very little aggression. Instead, that hierarchy is maintained by lower ranking individuals voluntarily displaying submission or voluntarily allowing the older adults to have access to resources. You can really think of this, I think there's a lot of parallels in human society if you think of human family groups. Very frequently, right, the older individuals are the ones that carry more status than the younger individuals. Of course, as I just spent a fair amount of time saying, dogs are not wolves, so we can't just look at wolves to get these answers. The evidence that we have, and again, this is a little inconsistent, but we do have several studies that have shown that stray dogs also form dominance hierarchies. But they may be less structured than in wolf packs, and the groups themselves seem to be less structured, so this makes sense. However, you do see that same pattern where the older dogs are typically higher ranked than the younger dogs. And there's 3 ways of maintaining stability, and this is not just unique to dogs. You see this in all kinds of species. You have these dominance displays. These are behaviors that they engage in to kind of indicate I'm higher ranking. You have submissive displays. This might be like lip licking, going down, kind of crouching down. And then you have aggression. But note that these first 2 don't involve aggression. They're just behavioral postures. And so in free ranging or stray dogs, when they're not actively competing over resources, these social relationships are primarily maintained through these formal behavioral displays. And you really don't see a lot of aggression. So very similar to wolves in this context. If resources are present, this could be food or females in heat, for example, then aggression is more common. So what you tend to see is that as long as they're not actively competing for resources, they're getting along pretty peacefully, but then you may see some increase in aggression over resources. Doesn't mean that they're actively fighting all of the time, but if you compare that to when they're not competing for food, aggression will be higher when there's food, limited food. However, that aggression rarely results in injury. So these are little tips that happen, and they tend to be resolved quickly, and there doesn't tend to be serious aggression or injury, excuse me. So that gives you a very quick rundown of stray dog behavior. And I know it was relatively short, but we just don't have a lot of information. So that's kind of what we know. We also know that, mom is usually involved in raising the puppies on her own. There's not typically a lot of help from dad, but that's about all we've got. So the next thing I want to talk about now is stress in dogs. And this is really going to come into play when we're starting to bring these dogs into our home and trying to have them adjust to that lifestyle. And this is really not specific to stray dogs at all. This is something that is a concern and a factor for all dogs, really all people. I mean, stress, is important for all species. So luckily, we know a lot more about stress than we do about stray dog behavior. And so first I want to talk about what stress is. So with stress, you have some kind of triggering event. Something happens that causes a disruption or a challenge to the status quo or the baseline. And then there's a physiological response to that stressor that includes the release of glucocorticoids, also known as stress hormones. And so stress is essentially a physiological response to some kind of challenge. That's what it is on the simplest terms. I think what's really the most helpful is to use a framework of looking at different kinds of stress, because not all stress is the same. In fact, they can be very, very different. So Dr. Bruce McEwen developed these different categories of stress that he labels good stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. And I'm going to talk about those next. So for good stress, this is when an animal goes through a challenging experience. So all stress is going to involve a challenging experience, but that experience ends up being rewarding in the long run. And as a result, the animal can experience personal growth. So when we're talking about this stress stuff, all of this applies to people as much as it does to dogs and at least other mammals. So So, for example, let's say we're teaching a dog a new skill, we're teaching them to do some kind of fun thing. That's going to be challenging because it's new. They haven't done it before. It's a change from what's normal. But if they're enjoying the experience, and it ends up being rewarded, then that's going to be an example of good stress. Physical exercise is stress. So if you go for a run, you are stressing your body, but it's good. I mean, it could be bad, it depends on how well conditioned you are and what kind of choices you're making. But, it has exercise in many, many cases is going to be good stress, but it's still a change from baseline. You're elevating your heart rate. Things like going to college can be good stress. It's challenging, you're going to school, but then you end up ultimately coming out better on the other end in many cases. Then we have tolerable stress. And the difference between tolerable stress and good stress is that the experience that's occurring with tolerable stress is negative. This is distressing to the individual. So something has happened, they're going through something, and it's upsetting. However, the animal is able to cope with that stress so that there aren't really any long-term negative impacts from this. And this often happens through, getting access to social support or sort of comfort from another person or individual, another dog, it could be, or having access to coping skills like exercising, or doing something enjoyable. We're going to talk about this a lot more tomorrow. But this is the key with tolerable stress, is that the animal is able to cope with that stress. And this can end up also resulting in personal growth. So I'm sure you guys can all think of experiences that you have been through that have been very upsetting at the time, but you feel like in the long run, it really caused you to grow as a person. And it seems like this can happen with other animals as well. Then we have toxic stress. This is also a negative and distressing experience. The difference between toxic stress and tolerable stress is that the animal is not able to cope with this stress. And so you start to see this sort of falling apart, this deterioration of health and behavior that the animal is not really able to recover from on their own, and they do start to have negative long-term impacts. Often this is because the animal lacks access to coping strategies or isn't able to engage in them for one reason or another. So this could be an animal living in a cage that doesn't have the ability to go out and exercise, or they're isolated. It can also happen because they have experienced previous stress in the past, and that actually did some damage. We don't have a lot of time to get into how that happens, but stress that happens during development actually changes the brain in a way that makes animals less capable of dealing with stress later on in life. So that could happen. And then there's many other factors that can play a role as well, things like genetics and learning, and then the qualities of the stressor, right? So obviously intense, prolonged stress is going to be much more difficult to manage than brief, mild stress. And chronic stress, by the way, stress that is just continues to occur, is almost always toxic stress. So when we're thinking about stress, what I really want to emphasize here is that it's not the stressor itself that matters. It's the animal's ability to cope with that stressor that matters. So you can have two dogs that go through the same experience, and one of them could be sort of forever damaged and never recover. And the other one may be impacted at the time and then be fine later on and really not have any noticeable long-term impacts. And I gave the example of going to college earlier. So for many people, that is good stress. Is this something that's enjoyable and they come out better in the long run, doesn't have any negative long-term impacts. For other people, that's going to be tolerable stress. They make it through, but it's really, really, really difficult, but they're able to cope with the help of friends or, doing different things that help them manage their stress levels. But then for some third category of people, it may be toxic stress. It may be that the stressors of going to school are just too much for that individual, or going through a breakup, or, you could pretty much pick anything and identify examples where some people are going to be okay and other people aren't. And the same is going to be true for our dogs. So what happens during the stress response? When an animal is stressed, the body is trying to mobilize itself to provide energy to critical systems that are needed in the moment. So that's going to involve things like increasing heart rate, blood pressure, and respiration, increasing energy in the form of glucose, blood sugar, increasing sensory function and certain types of memory, and then decreasing pain perception, right? Because if you're running for your life and you stub your toe, you don't want to stop everything to focus on the fact that your toe hurts. You want to continue to run for your life. And so pain perception's also going to go down. On the other hand, there are certain systems that really aren't needed. I say fight or flight here, so that's sort of a common way of referring to the stress response, although it's not always fight or flight. There could be other behaviors that occur. But again, if you're running for your life or you're trying to catch food, or you're experiencing some kind of stressor, it doesn't really make sense to be focused on reproduction in that moment. Same thing for the immune system. If you have a cold, yes, eventually you want to fight off the cold, but not when you're running from a tiger, right? Growth gets shut down and digestion. These are just some of the examples. So in the short run, this is good because it allows the animal to focus all of its resources on surviving in that moment. But in the long run, these things can become a problem. So when an animal's experiencing chronic stress, you start to see issues. So that's the next thing I'm going to talk about, is the different impacts of stress. I mentioned developmental stress before, and that is stress that occurs during development. So when we're talking about development, we're talking about anything from that prenatal period, so the puppies that mom is pregnant with, all the way through adolescence. And so in dogs, we think that adolescence probably lasts until roughly 1.5 years of age, but that's going to vary. So sometime between 1 year and 2 years is going to be the adolescent period. And then, of course, anything in between is going to be considered developmental stress. So animals that experience chronic stress during this period, or really, really severe stress like trauma, the stress response system gets restructured. It becomes, so one thing that frequently happens is that the animal will become hyper responsive to stress. So they respond to triggers much more quickly and much more easily and intensely than they would have otherwise. And it literally changes the structure and function of the brain if this happens during development. And then those changes often last throughout the life of the animal. And so this is why we really want to minimize the amount of stress that's happening during development. So this sounds really awful. And I mean, it is awful, but probably what's happening, what we think is happening, is that this development is actually trying to prepare animals for life in their current environment. So if we take stray dogs as an example, right, if they're being born stray and they're living on their own, there are threats to their life. There are things that they need to worry about. They do need to be vigilant to make sure, they're looking for food and protecting themselves. And so if they're growing up in that environment, I'm trying to think. So developing this sort of threat-based outlook actually might help them survive. So it kind of makes sense that if you're growing up in a potentially threatening environment, your body wants to prepare you to survive in that potentially threatening environment. Where we start to run into problems is when we have animals that grow up in a stressful environment that are then moved into a safe environment. And now there's this mismatch between how they developed and how they're living now. And so when we think about stray dogs, the question is, well, are stray dogs under chronic stress? And this question is actually a little bit complicated because the answer is yes and no. In many ways, they probably are under chronic stress, although it's going to vary. But many of these dogs probably, have been exposed to illnesses. They may have limited food, although I understand a lot of the dogs are fed. So that's going to probably depend on circumstances, depends on the region that they're in and the country and a number of different things. But that could be food stress, could be an issue. There may be other animals that they have conflict with that can be problems. So there are definitely threats in their environment. Dealing with weather, all those kinds of things can be stressful. And they also are free. And this is, I don't want to underestimate this or underemphasize this, because the ability to make decisions and have control over their own lives is one of the key factors that helps animals cope with stress. So they kind of have both things going on. This isn't a totally black and white picture. I think in a lot of ways, these guys are suffering. And in some ways, they aren't, I guess, is the easiest way to say that. So it's both. It's yes and no. And I'm not arguing. I'm not saying we should just not do anything about them. But I do just want to recognize the fact that it's not all bad, right? So this is a partial list. When I was talking about chronic stress, this is a partial list of the impacts of chronic stress on health. So as we talked about before, stress shuts down certain systems. It shuts down growth, immune function, reproduction, and digestion. And so it's no surprise that these systems are going to be impacted. So animals that experience chronic stress or stress during development often show decreased growth, decreased immune function, issues with reproduction, slower healing, GI problems, and then the cardiovascular system is also impacted. So heart issues, muscle loss. And as I'm sure you can imagine, if these things are going on, that's going to impact behavioral health. We're going to talk about that more in a second. And it even leads to early death. And we have really good evidence to support this, especially in humans and probably rodents as well. Tiny amount of evidence on this in dogs, but everything we know about stress shows that these impacts are very consistent from one species to another. So we really have no reason to believe that we wouldn't see a similar type of impact in dogs. In terms of specifically how it impacts behavior, it increases fear and anxiety, decreases social interaction or social skills that, it can, these things aren't guaranteed. Because again, it depends partly how well the dog is at coping with these and genetics, but you have a much higher risk of these things. It decreases their ability to cope with current stress. We talked about that earlier. It decreases their ability to experience pleasure. And so all of these things, of course, are going to lead to increased risk of behavior issues. So things like fear and anxiety, aggression, barking and lunging on leash, destructive behavior, etc. And some of you at this point may be feeling very down and discouraged. And I don't want to leave you with that feeling. The reason I'm presenting you with this information is because I want you to understand the different things that may be impacting the behavior of these stray dogs, especially when they're coming into homes, because if we understand what's going on, then we have much greater ability to change it and to help the dogs so that they have happier lives and we have a more sort of enjoyable, harmonious relationship with them. So I did want to mention adolescent dogs. So they're kind of a special case. So these adolescent dogs, these 6 to 18 month-ish age, we don't have really good numbers on that. These guys, they're still in development. So they're vulnerable to stress. So they're sensitive to stress during that period of time. And stress that they have experienced earlier in life may start to influence their behavior at this point. So you may start to see a lot of behavior issues developing during adolescence, but at the same time, they're still vulnerable to increased stress. So we have to really make sure we're taking, I mean, any animal during development we want to take care of, but adolescents can often be more challenging. This is true for people too, by the way. So when we're adopting stray dogs, they're used to living their lives loose with a lot of agency, so a lot of control over their behavior. And there's all these other things going on that are decreasing their welfare, right? So I don't want to just say like, oh, they're living this amazing, great, wonderful, perfect life, because they're not, but this is an advantage. This is something that they are used to. This is probably the primary advantage of being a stray dog. Then if they're adopted, they're brought into this new world. And so now they're confined, they're living in an urban environment, they're having much closer contact with people, possibly, depending on the situation, decreased social interaction with other dogs, but they're getting all of these other things that they weren't getting before. So medical care, food, shelter, right? So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And again, I'm really not trying to make an argument that's saying that we shouldn't be trying to help and adopt these dogs, just recognizing the full complexity of the situation. And so this is our challenge, right? This is our challenge, is how can we deal with the fact that there's these stray dogs out there and then there's all these problems that come with that, while also making sure that we're giving them the best lives possible, even if we are, or, when we do adopt them and bring them into our homes. And so, this change for them is going to be stressful. It's going to be, in many cases, a difficult adjustment. And so recognizing that will allow us to help them work through that. So they're going to need our support. And tomorrow, the whole talk is going to be on how we can do this. I'm just going to touch on it a little bit now, and then we'll get into questions. And so if you can't attend live tomorrow, it should be up on Facebook, so you guys will still get that information, or Facebook, on YouTube, sorry. So basically what we can do, we can't change their history, but we can do things that can help them cope with stress. So making sure that they're getting adequate exercise. We have a lot of evidence that this helps animals cope with stress. It actually, again, it changes the brain in a way that allows the brain to cope better with stress. Enrichment, allowing them to engage in sort of species typical dog-like behaviors. We're going to talk about this more tomorrow, but things like sniffing and being in natural areas if you have access to those. Social support. So comforting dogs is fine. It's good. It's helpful. So if you have a dog that's nervous and anxious and upset, you're not going to do any damage by comforting them, petting them, letting them hang out with you. That can actually help them cope better with stress. Increasing predictability. So trying to have less sort of surprise and chaos. So one of the things that's really hard about stressors is if they're unpredictable, if you never know when something's going to happen. So if the dog is worried about something, trying to teach them that it sort of happens in the same context every time and pairing it with good things, that can be helpful. We don't have time to cover all the details of that today. But trying, or even just being consistent, that's probably the easiest thing to do, right? So make sure everyone in the household, for example, is following the same rules, because otherwise the dog isn't sure what to expect. And make sure you're following the same rules from one day to another in terms of what's expected of the dog. And then increasing their control. And again, we're going to talk about this more tomorrow. This doesn't mean let them do whatever they want, but try and give them some additional choice and control in certain situations. And I'll give you specific examples tomorrow. Also be patient, right? They're probably going to need a lot of time and space to adjust to this new experience, and making sure that they have what they need. And some dogs may, some dogs may come in and adjust relatively quickly, and other dogs are going to struggle a lot more, and they're going to need a lot more time and space. So as I said, we'll talk about this in more detail tomorrow. So if anyone has questions for me beyond what we're about to cover right now, this is my contact information. You can get in touch with me through the website. And that's it for today. Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you so much, Christina, for your presentation. It's really, really illuminating, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And we've learned so much about behavior and ethology of stray dogs today. So we'll now open the floor to Q&A, and thank you in advance to everyone who has put in a question. Apologies in advance if we don't get through all of them due to the shortage of time. So let's go to the first question. Okay. Pull it up. So there was a study recently in Science that showed that behaviors do not really differ between breeds. Could you comment on whether the trigger of certain behaviors may be different between breeds, although the behavioral repertoire of these animals might not be different?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably what's happening. It's probably, I haven't read this study yet. I do plan to read it because I'll probably give a talk on that as well. But this study has been really making the rounds a lot. And it's a complex study. We don't have a lot of time to talk about it. But yeah, when we do see differences related to genetics, one of the ways that those may manifest is that those triggers are different. So you may have some dogs, for example, that respond much more intensely to the same trigger than another dog would. And that then is going to impact all kinds of things, right? So if you're walking out in the world and every little thing is creating a strong emotional response in you, you're going to have a very different behavioral profile than if you're not even noticing those little things, right? So that it's not the only way I would say that genetics impacts behavior, but it is certainly one way is that those thresholds change.
Okay. We certainly do hope to have a talk with you then about the paper. Okay, the second question is there a measure or range of measures that we can use to differentiate between good and tolerable and toxic stress?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not always easy. And we don't have anything super concrete. So one thing that you can look at is body language to at least tell if the dog seems to be distressed or not, because that's the first thing we need to determine. And so, people can kind of search that online. Lily Chin, I think it's Chen. She is an artist that has done a lot of amazing illustrations on dog behavior. So if you look her up, that is a great way to start learning about body language in dogs. So that's one thing, is learn their body language. And then the other thing I look for is things like, what is their recovery time? So if something bad happens, do they kind of startle and then recover, or are they now like done for hours or the rest of the day? Those are kind of two extremes. But if the dog is really struggling to recover, that's a sign that they're probably experiencing toxic stress. If you're seeing a lot of anxiety and fear in a wide range of environments and it's happening very frequently, that's probably a sign of toxic stress. Not always, but often aggression is a sign that aggression can be normal form of communication. But especially if you're seeing a lot of it or it's getting worse, that's a concern. And then even simple things like not taking food. So if you're working with a dog and they normally take food and now they're not, that's a sign that they're probably crossing over into toxic stress. And if it's just a moment, like they're getting overwhelmed in the moment and you pull back, they can recover. That's fine. I don't want people to panic because they feel like their dog is experiencing toxic stress. It's that continued toxic stress that's a problem. And I may have already said this, but deterioration of behavior, like if they're getting worse and worse, then that's also a sign.
Yeah. Okay, the next question is, do you think that stray puppies are more prone to behavior problems, such as aggression and anxiety, given the stressful environment that they may have grown up in?
So probably. This one, I'm just a little hesitant to answer this question because I'm not really knowledgeable about the specifics of the stray dog population in Singapore, but probably. But it's going to depend on what you're comparing them to, right? So I don't know if you guys have this, but we have puppy mills in the United States. So you have dogs that are being bred in these really large commercial breeding facilities that are also being raised in really horrible conditions. So I would not expect stray dogs, puppies, to be more stressed than those dogs. In fact, they might actually be less stressed, but probably they're going to be more stressed than a dog that's being bred by a knowledgeable breeder and providing everything they need from the beginning.
Yep. Okay, the next question is also on strays. Will targeting rehoming of these free-ranging dogs before they're 1 year old help to reduce the stress experienced by these dogs and make them less susceptible to relinquishment?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Probably that yes, I that would be my prediction, is that if you're going to try and rehome these guys, that doing it as young as possible. Well, I mean, we don't want to probably remove them from mom too young, but before 1 year of age, that would be my prediction, is that would probably go better than if you're taking older dogs.
Okay, the next question is on how do you decide when a stray animal is experiencing so much stress that it is actually suffering and that it's no longer ethical to continue caring for these animals in our homes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really hard one. So, I talked before about some of the signs of toxic stress. So that's the first thing, is you have to determine what their level of stress is. And looking for signs like fear and anxiety, and reading that body language and trying to determine how often they're feeling these negative emotions. I say it like it's really clear cut. It's not always easy, but simply identifying that they may be under toxic stress, I don't think that alone is enough to say that they shouldn't be in the home, because there's a lot we can do. So the next thing to do would be to start trying some of these interventions, start trying some of these things to reduce their stress. And I'm going to talk about a lot, but not all of them tomorrow. See if you can find a qualified behavior consultant that can help and really work with them, because there is often a lot that we can do. And only if you've really worked extensively with someone who's using positive force-free methods, by the way, not punishment-based, because that can make stress worse. Only then would I start to think about, is this maybe not the right environment for the dog? There are certain situations where maybe right away we would decide it's not okay if you're living with kids and the dog is biting the kids or something, then we need to get them. Or if they're terrified of traffic noise and you live on an extremely busy street and you can't control that, and there may be certain situations, but frequently we can help them without having to rehome them.
Yep. The next question is related to stress as well. How do you measure stress in stray animals?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you probably couldn't measure stress in stray animals without going in and actually doing some kind of data like collection. So you could, what they do in wild species that they study this in, is they'll go in and they'll collect fecal samples. And then the fecal samples go into the lab, and then they can measure stress hormone levels that way and get at levels of stress. But it's not the type of thing like an individual could probably easily do on their own. Like, you would probably have to test that in a lab, because I mean, you can try looking at body language, but that's going to be tricky, because simply the fact that you're there is going to change the behavior. Maybe setting up cameras and looking at their behavior, but that's a little tough to get at.
Yep. Okay, I've got one last question. Mindful it's almost 9. This one is on developmental stress. Would a dog ever recover from developmental stress?
Yeah, so these are all really good questions. So yes and no. So so first of all, if you catch a dog during development, you can do more, because you still can change things while they're developing. So for example, if you are bringing in these younger dogs, at the very least, what you're doing is you're arresting that developmental stress early on, ideally, and maybe getting them on a better path so you can prevent some of the damage. If you're dealing with either an older dog, or you have a younger dog and you're having trouble getting that stress level down fast enough, that brain, it is going to change, and those changes are going to happen, and we cannot go back after the fact and reverse them. But it does seem to be pretty good evidence that in many cases, we can improve their abilities to cope with that stress. So you may have that sort of initial brain structure in place that this dog is going to be more reactive. But if you can do things that help them deal with that more effectively, then you in many cases will still have the ability to improve their quality of life and decrease some of those unwanted behaviors, so that you can see substantial improvement. So it's more about teaching them to cope with stress and compensate for those changes in the brain than to literally go back and change it.
Yep, I think that's all the time that we have for today. And thank you so much, Kristina, and for everyone who submitted a question. We've come to the end of the webinar today, and we've hoped that you managed to gain some useful perspective on stray dog behavior and how to help these dogs adapt into pet life. Head over to our Facebook page, Animal Buzz SG, for more educational information on animal ethology, and like the page for regular content. We hope that you can join us for tomorrow's talk by Kristina again at 8 p.m., where we will be discussing how to improve the welfare and quality of life for dogs under our care. If you did not manage to catch today's session, you can also view it live by visiting the NParks SG YouTube page or scanning and saving the QR code below. Thank you very much, Kristina, and for everyone for joining us this evening. See you all tomorrow.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.